Hello, my friends, hello, and welcome once again to stately Von Manor, where Roger and I have returned because it's Wednesday. That means it's Epic Comic Book Wednesday. Every Wednesday, we'll talk about a certain comic book, graphic novel, or comic book subject. Steve Donoghue over on his channel will talk about the same comic book, graphic novel, or comic book subject. It is our world's finest team up that we do once a week. And this week is particularly fascinating because we're talking about a fairly important character in the Bronze Age of Marvel Comics. He arrived in the Marvel Universe in a meteoric flash and stayed for many issues, a good chunk of the early 80s, and then his story was told. And like an evil pharaoh, his memory was wiped out, destroyed from history. Just like someone else I know. Yes, my friends, today we're talking about ROM. It's time to talk about ROM and the arrival of ROM in the Marvel Universe, the first exciting issue of ROM. Of course, the entire ROM saga has fairly recently been published in 3 omnibus volumes, but now it's being published in epic collections. And just yesterday, I got the second exciting volume of ROM. You know, good stuff, ROM. And he takes a pretty big place in the Marvel Universe during the early 1980s. But then, like I said, he was wiped from history. So ROM, it's ROM. So let's talk about this character, his arrival, where he came from, and, why he vanished. Well, that's easy to say because ROM was not an original creation of Marvel Comics. ROM was a licensed character. I will show you an advertisement. This is the ROM toy. You could find this advertisement in the Marvel Comics of the time. ROM was a toy. It didn't look even as cool as this character here. ROM was a terrible toy. If you've ever seen it, it's lame. I can't imagine anybody actually playing with the ROM toy. And in fact, when I picked up the Marvel comic, I had no idea that there was a ROM toy or that this comic was based on a toy. Marvel Comics does have a pretty good track record of making comic books based on toys. The best example of that is G.I. Joe, which actually became a pretty good comic book, which I have to continue reading. I have a giant G.I. Joe book, which is languishing back there. But they also did a good job on Micronauts, and I think they did a pretty good job on ROM. Not everybody agrees. If you watch Steve's video, I'm thinking he probably will disagree that ROM was a good comic. I enjoyed the hell out of it though. And I picked it up when I was 8 years old. This came out in 1979. Yeah, December of 1979. So I was almost 9, Roger. And the first issue really got my attention. Arrival, first issue. And it looked awesome. So they reproduce it here, the cover. That's a Frank Miller cover, and it's really nice. And of course, I saw that cover and I wanted to get the comic. But then you picked up the comic off the rack and you opened it up to the splash page and you get this. And then I had to get it. Because that's a fantastic opening page. It's just glorious, which shows the arrival of ROM. ROM arrives on the scene. This is Sal Buscema artwork, and it's fantastic. It was actually based on artwork by John Romita Jr. He did the original layout for that page, which is reproduced here at the back of the book. And it was so spectacular that they used it not just for the opening page, but also for the advertisement when they were advertising ROM and other comics. It's just fantastic. And our pal Sal Buscema did the artwork for the initial issue. And it was just spectacular. So ROM arrives on Earth. So ROM was a toy created by Parker Brothers. Marvel got the license to do a comic book on the toy. And so they hired, or they assigned, Bill Mantlo and Sal Buscema to do the book. And they did a comic that was probably better than it had any right to be, because it was based on this, not just a toy, but a dumb toy. It was a really dumb toy. But the comic book was actually quite successful. And off the top of my head, I'm forgetting how many issues it ran. I think it ran like 60 issues or something. I'll have to look. I should have looked it up before I did this, Roger, but you know it's early. What the hell time is it anyway? It is 4:31 in the morning. I haven't had coffee. I haven't had breakfast. It's more important to do Epic Comic Book Wednesday, Roger. So I don't remember how many issues ROM ran, and I should, because I bought every issue. I got every issue of ROM from that first issue. I picked it up. I really enjoyed it, and I picked up every issue afterwards. It is a series that eventually did kind of go downhill. Eventually, Steve Ditko was doing the artwork on ROM. Steve Ditko in the 80s was not the Steve Ditko that he was in the 60s. Although his work on ROM wasn't all that bad from what I remember. But it's been a long time. And I picked up the first 2 omnibus volumes of ROM, and now that they're coming out with the whole series, Epic Collections, I'm going to get every single one of those. But I haven't actually sat down and read ROM again for years. It took years and years and years for ROM to arrive in reprint volumes because Marvel lost the license and just never got it back. I guess they figured it was never worth the money. But the problem was with ROM is that ROM did become pretty quickly a pretty big part of the Marvel Universe. He interacted with the X-Men, he interacted with a bunch of other characters. He interacted pretty much almost with everybody eventually by the end of his series. And all those appearances from ROM could not be reprinted again ever. There was for example, there was a Power Man and Iron Fist issue with ROM in it. And when they did the Epic Collection, they could not include that issue because ROM was in it. And so you have an incomplete Epic Collection. Actually, that story is reprinted here. So if you have those Power Man and Iron Fist Epic Collections and you actually want the whole series, you have to get this. Sorry. But you have to. And you have to get it before it's gone. If Marvel does what they did with Conan a few years ago, they got the rights to Conan, and they kept it just long enough to print a bunch of omnibuses and some Epic Collections, make some money off those, and then they just didn't get the license again. They might do the same thing with ROM, where they just keep the license long enough to do a bunch of reprint volumes and then let it go. I wouldn't be surprised. I certainly don't think they would bring ROM back and have ROM interact with a bunch of Marvel characters in comic books that could never be reprinted once the license is gone. Of course, they didn't think about that in the 80s because nobody thought in the 1980s that eventually you would want to reprint all of these comics. The 80s were the days when you had some original graphic novels being published. There were some collected editions, but not like now. Now we're collecting everything. And so once ROM was gone, he was gone. And he was wiped from existence, leaving a big ROM-sized hole in the Marvel Universe. But now we can enjoy ROM's great adventures. And let's take a look at ROM's arrival, because it was pretty spectacular, as you can see. And Sal Buscema is an artist who I think is still underrated. I don't think he's as underrated as some other artists I could think of, but I think Sal Buscema is underrated because he was a lot better than people give him credit for. I think one problem Sal had is that he drew so quickly that he literally drew everything. I mean, if they needed a comic book in the 1970s or 80s to be drawn really quick, they just got Sal. And some of the artwork that he did really, really quickly wasn't as good as some of the other artwork that he did. But I think eventually he proved himself on comics like Spectacular Spider-Man. He did a great run on Thor. He did some good stuff. And of course, he was great on the Hulk. But I think my favorite Sal Buscema artwork is probably ROM. Because he just took this character and just made him awesome. And so I reread this comic book the other night for the first time in forever. And here we have ROM arriving on Earth. And immediately a car nearly crashes into him. But he rescues the lady in the car. But then he uses this strange device on her. And she thinks it's some kind of death ray. It's not. We don't know at this point what the hell ROM is doing with this thing. Eventually, it becomes clear. And so Brandy Clark, that's the young woman's name, Brandy, she is shaken by this encounter with ROM, and ROM flies off after he checks her out. And we get a scene from small town America. And ROM arrives, the alien from outer space. Now, I'm going to just say one thing I noticed reading ROM for the first time in decades, this first issue, is that I noticed something that I didn't notice, of course, when I was a kid reading for the first time. And that's that there's not an original idea anywhere in ROM, which is, that's not a knock, really. It's just that this comic book takes ideas from all kinds of different places and just swipes them and puts it in the comic. You've got ideas everywhere from The Day the Earth Stood Still to the Silver Surfer, Marvel's own Silver Surfer comic, to the Invasion of the Body Snatchers and a million 1950s horror science fiction movies. You get ideas, the Hulk, there's a little bit of the Hulk in here. You get ideas from everywhere, all stuck in this one comic. And it's really kind of interesting the way they pulled it off, because it's actually a pretty compelling alien invasion story. So what we learn fairly quickly is that there are aliens called the dire Wraiths that have invaded the Earth, but nobody knows that. But they can completely mimic, like the Skrulls, they can mimic human beings. And they are probably here for nefarious purposes, of course. And so what ROM does when he arrives is he breaks out this scanner, and that's what it is. But everybody thinks it must be some kind of weapon. So he uses the scanner, and what the scanner does is he can use it to tell whether people are dire wraiths or human beings. And once he scanned them, he can tell the dire wraiths. And so these two shifty characters, Sal Buscema is great at drawing shifty characters, are dire wraiths. And they know who ROM is. They recognize ROM right away. He's been out for 200 years chasing dire wraiths. And so what does he do? You can see. He seems to just kill them with two sharp blasts from this new weapon that just materializes in his hands, leaving them just smoking heaps of dust. And he just stands there and he's like, okay, job well done. But that freaks everybody out, of course, because it seems like ROM has murdered these two people. And these are two people that the townsfolk have known for years. They're just members of the town. But what really happened is that ROM used his scanner. He could tell that they're dire wraiths, and he used his weapon. But what the weapon actually did was send the dire wraiths to limbo. He sent them to limbo, Roger, because there's a lot of supernatural shenanigans going on in ROM. It's not just science fiction. There's some other stuff going on in ROM. So the dire wraiths have been sent to limbo, because that's what ROM does. He hunts the dire wraiths down, and when he finds them, off to limbo they go. Doesn't actually kill them, He sends them to limbo. But as far as everybody else is concerned, he's just killed two people. So everybody thinks he's a big monster, when in fact, he's just getting rid of the dire wraiths, which, should be done anyway. He's like an exterminator, getting rid of the pests, the evil dire wraiths who are infiltrating humanity. And of course, there are some dire wraiths in very high places. So the dire wraith infestation has reached critical heights. The dire wraiths are all over human society. They have nefarious purposes. They're going to do evil things because they're aliens. And they've done it before. As Rom tells Brandy, we get the legend of the Space Knight. So we get an origin of Rom. Now, look, Rom's people look just like regular, ordinary human beings from the 1970s. They're just 70s people off in space. And so, wouldn't you know it, they just look like regular people, not aliens at all. But the dire wraiths, they're pretty creepy. We don't really know what they look like yet. Eventually, we do get see the original look or the accurate look at the real dire wraiths, and they're pretty disgusting. But we don't get to see them right away, so they're just shadowy characters in these early issues of ROM. And we get a tale of the space war. The dire wraiths wipe out ROM's people. They're going to come and destroy the planet, and so we have to do something. So in order to do something, volunteers have to be called to sacrifice their humanity, including Hippie Rom. Hippie Rom, young Rom, says, I will sacrifice my humanity to fight the dire wraiths. And how do they do that? Well, they're turned into Space Knights. They're turned into cyborgs, basically. So inside of Rom is at least some bits of a human being. And there's a person in there. So Rom is actually not a giant robot. He looks like he's just a big giant robot, but he's not. He's a cyborg. And he gave up his humanity to get superpowers in order to fight the dire wraiths. And so that he could hunt the dire wraiths across the universe, where he eventually ends up on Earth, where there are dire wraiths everywhere. And he has to fight them. And as we see here, this is an illustrated representation of Rom seeming to kill somebody, but actually sending a dire wraith to limbo. See, that's what he does. But, the humans don't see it that way. They just think he killed some people. So immediately the army shows up. The dire wraiths who are in power made sure that the army showed up really quickly. And Rom has no problem with the soldiers. Tanks are nothing to Rom. He's that powerful. And so we see that Rom is not just superpowered. I mean, he's like the Thing level superpowered. He's really, really strong and really, really tough. And he just tosses the tanks around like nothing, and it's all glorious because Sal Buscema is doing a hell of a job on this comic book. But a soldier sees, oh, this isn't working, and the soldier is a dire wraith, so he just pulls out this laser gun, this space weapon, which he just had hanging around, and pulls it out of his bag because he knew he was going to fight Rom, and he shoots it, and it actually hurts Rom, but not enough. Rom sends him to limbo, which makes the general there think, oh my goodness, he's killing my soldiers now. He's a monster. But Rom gets away because, what are people going to do? He just completely flattened the army. And by the end, some dire wraiths tried to attack our girl Brandy, who becomes a very important character in Rom. And Rom shows up, saves her, sends those guys to limbo, and flies off. And that was the beginning of Rom. And Rom continues, usually with pretty great covers. Rom at this period had just some fantastic covers. You had to pick them up. You had to pick up this comic. And so you continue. That's such a Sal Buscema look. Look at that. You continue to have Rom fighting the army, but also he gets some super-powered opponents. some other aliens show up. ROM was a good time. And it was a very entertaining comic. Again, much better than it had any right to be. And I loved it. Was it the greatest comic book in the world? No. Was it a tremendously original comic with original ideas? No. But it was fun, and it was well done. And it was some of the best work Sal Buscema ever did, in my opinion. And so it's worth picking up ROM just for that. Because he just does such a great job on this character. This character eventually becomes, a pretty interesting character. He has great adventures, lots of issues, pondering his humanity and his sacrifice. Other characters make great sacrifices in ROM. It's interesting. It's fun. It's ROM. And I'm glad they finally reprinted this series and are doing this series of epic collections, because in the Bronze Age of comics, it was a fairly important title in Marvel and lasted a long, long time. Was it the best title? No, but it was cool, and I'm glad ROM is back. And that's all I have to say about it. You can go watch Steve tell you how terrible it was now. I will catch you next time.